You're sitting at the most exclusive dinner party in all of Europe. The year is 1560, and the golden plates before you gleam with what appears to be the finest delicacies money can buy. The woman beside you, draped in jewels worth more than entire kingdoms, raises her goblet in a toast to your health. Her smile is radiant, her laugh musical, and her reputation as the most gracious hostess in all of Hungary is legendary. You take a bite of the exquisitely prepared meat, savoring flavors you've never experienced before, wondering what exotic spice gives it such a unique taste. What you don't know is that you're dining with Elizabeth Báthory, and the meat dissolving on your tongue once walked, talked, and screamed for mercy in the dungeons beneath your feet. The woman you're toasting has just served you human flesh as the evening's main course, and she's watching your face with the calculating gaze of someone who has perfected the art of turning cannibalism into cuisine. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Tonight, we're entering the twisted world of Europe's most notorious female serial killer, but this isn't the sanitized version you might have heard before. This is the story of how aristocratic privilege, unchecked power, and psychological sadism combined to create a monster who didn't just murder hundreds of people, but turned their bodies into elaborate feasts for unsuspecting guests. Elizabeth Báthory wasn't content with simple killing. She transformed torture into art, murder into entertainment, and human flesh into haute cuisine. The woman who would become known as the Blood Countess was born into a world where power meant everything, and human life meant nothing, at least if you belonged to the wrong social class. In 1560, Hungary was a nation caught between empires, its nobility desperately clinging to ancient privileges while Ottoman armies pressed from the south, and Habsburg influence grew from the west. Into this chaotic world came Elizabeth, born to one of the most powerful families in the kingdom. The Báthory name carried weight that could topple governments and shift the balance of European politics. Her uncle, Stephen Báthory, would become King of Poland. Her cousins held positions as princes, generals, and church leaders throughout Eastern Europe. But with this incredible power came something darker, a family legacy that seemed to corrupt everyone it touched. The Báthorys were known for their intelligence, their ambition, and their complete disregard for anyone they considered beneath them. Elizabeth's childhood unfolded in Čachtice Castle, a massive fortress that dominated the Hungarian countryside like a stone giant. The castle's walls had witnessed centuries of violence, but nothing could have prepared them for what Elizabeth would bring to their ancient halls. Even as a child, servants whispered about her unusual interests. While other noble children played with dolls or learned music, Elizabeth was fascinated by the castle's dungeons, by the screams that echoed from the torture chambers, by the way blood looked when it pooled on stone floors. Her tutors, brave men who had educated princes and cardinals, found themselves disturbed by their young pupils' questions. She wanted to know exactly how long it took for someone to bleed to death. She asked detailed questions about different methods of torture, showing a scholarly interest that would have been impressive if it weren't so deeply unsettling. When punishments were carried out in the castle courtyard, Elizabeth would position herself at her window, watching with the focused attention other children reserved for puppet shows. The first signs of her true nature emerged when Elizabeth was barely 12 years old. A servant girl, perhaps 14 herself, had accidentally broken one of Elizabeth's favorite mirrors while cleaning her chambers. What happened next would establish a pattern that would define the rest of Elizabeth's life. Rather than simply punishing the girl through the usual means, flogging or dismissal, Elizabeth decided to create her own form of justice. She ordered the girl stripped and tied to a wooden post in the castle's wine cellar. Then, with the methodical precision of someone conducting a scientific experiment, Elizabeth began cutting the girl with broken pieces of the very mirror she had destroyed. But this wasn't random violence driven by childish rage. Elizabeth had planned every cut, every slice with careful attention to causing maximum pain while avoiding fatal injuries. She wanted the experience to last. What truly horrified the servants who discovered the scene wasn't just the torture itself, but Elizabeth's demeanor throughout the ordeal. Witnesses later testified that she remained completely calm, almost cheerful, as if she were arranging flowers rather than flaying human skin. She hummed while she worked, pausing occasionally to study her handiwork with the critical eye of an artist evaluating a painting. The servant girl survived, but she was never the same. The physical scars healed, but the psychological damage ran so deep that she could barely speak coherently about her experience. When questioned by castle officials, she could only repeat the same phrase over and over. She smiled the whole time. She never stopped smiling. Elizabeth's parents, faced with clear evidence of their daughter's sadistic tendencies, made the decision that would seal the fate of countless future victims. Rather than seeking help or attempting to correct her behavior, they chose to cover up the incident entirely. The servant girl was quietly dismissed with a small payment to ensure her silence, and Elizabeth received no punishment whatsoever. In fact, her parents seemed almost proud of their daughter's decisive handling of what they viewed as a discipline problem. This response taught Elizabeth two crucial lessons that would shape her entire approach to murder and torture. First, that her noble birth gave her absolute power over the lives of those beneath her social station. Second, that violence could be hidden, sanitized, and even celebrated if it was framed properly. She learned that the right story could transform any atrocity into acceptable behavior, and that her family's wealth and influence could make almost any crime disappear. As Elizabeth entered her teenage years, her experiments in cruelty became more sophisticated and more frequent. The castle's servant population lived in constant terror, never knowing when they might be selected for one of her lessons. She developed an elaborate system for choosing victims, taking careful notes about their physical characteristics, their family backgrounds, and their psychological responses to different forms of torture. Her notebooks from this period, discovered centuries later hidden in the castle walls, read like the research journals of a demented scientist. She documented which types of pain produced the most interesting screams, which cutting techniques caused the most visually striking blood patterns, and which psychological torments broke her victim's spirits most completely. Elizabeth approached torture with the same methodical dedication that other nobles brought to hunting or music. But perhaps most disturbing was her growing fascination with the connection between violence and consumption. Elizabeth began experimenting with what she called the complete utilization of resources, a euphemistic way of describing her transformation from simple torture into something far more monstrous. She started by forcing her victims to consume their own blood, telling them it would help them recover from their injuries. Then she began mixing human blood into wine, serving it to unsuspecting guests at dinner parties as a sort of private joke. The transition from forcing victims to consume human blood to consuming it herself seemed almost inevitable in retrospect. Elizabeth's first taste of human flesh came when she was 17, during what she later described in her journals as a moment of scientific curiosity. She had been torturing a kitchen maid who had burned a piece of bread, and in the midst of her fury, she bit deeply into the girl's shoulder, tearing away a substantial piece of flesh. Instead of being horrified by what she had done, Elizabeth found herself intrigued by the taste. She described it in her journal with the same detailed attention she brought to wine tasting, noting the texture, the flavor, and the way it made her feel. More importantly, she began to develop theories about the nutritional and spiritual benefits of consuming human flesh, particularly flesh from young, healthy victims. This marked the beginning of what Elizabeth would later call her dietary experiments, a systematic exploration of cannibalism that would eventually evolve into the elaborate dinner parties that made her infamous throughout Europe. But she was careful, methodical, and patient in her approach. Elizabeth understood that her ultimate goals would require years of preparation, extensive resources, and absolute secrecy. She began by expanding her knowledge of anatomy, studying medical texts that described the human body in precise detail. She learned which cuts of meat were most tender, which organs provided the best nutrition, and which preparation methods would disguise the true nature of what she was serving. Elizabeth approached cannibalism with the same scholarly dedication that master chefs brought to traditional cuisine, treating human flesh as simply another ingredient to be mastered. Simultaneously, she began cultivating relationships with the most influential nobles throughout Hungary and beyond. Elizabeth understood that her cannibalistic dinner parties would only be possible if she could attract guests important enough that their attendance would legitimize whatever she chose to serve. She needed people whose social standing was so elevated that they would never question the quality or source of food served at a Báthory table. Her marriage to Ferenc Nadasdy in 1575 provided the perfect opportunity to establish herself as one of Europe's premier hostesses. Ferenc, known as the Black Knight of Hungary, was frequently away on military campaigns, leaving Elizabeth with complete control over their various castles and estates. More importantly, his fearsome reputation on the battlefield gave Elizabeth's household an aura of danger that discouraged too much curiosity about her domestic arrangements. The wedding itself was a spectacular affair that attracted nobles from across Europe, giving Elizabeth her first opportunity to test her theories about serving human flesh to unsuspecting guests. The elaborate feast included dozens of courses, each prepared with Elizabeth's characteristic attention to detail. Hidden among the traditional meats, disguised with exotic spices and elegant presentation, were carefully prepared portions of human flesh. Elizabeth watched her wedding guests with fascination as they consumed her special delicacies, taking mental notes about their reactions and preferences. She was particularly interested in observing which guests seemed to enjoy the unusual flavors most, marking them in her mind as potential regular attendees at future dinner parties. The success of this initial experiment convinced Elizabeth that she could indeed transform cannibalism into an accepted form of aristocratic entertainment. But wedding feasts were special occasions, and Elizabeth wanted to establish a regular pattern of dinner parties that would allow her to pursue her interests on a consistent basis. This required developing a reliable supply of victims, a network of servants who could be trusted with her secrets, and preparation methods that would consistently produce high-quality results. The solution came in the form of what Elizabeth called her finishing school for young ladies. She began advertising throughout Hungary and neighboring countries, offering to provide education and training for daughters of minor nobility who couldn't afford the finest tutors and schools. Parents throughout Eastern Europe began sending their daughters to Elizabeth's castle, believing they were providing their children with opportunities for advancement in aristocratic society. In reality, these young women were walking into a carefully constructed trap that would end with their bodies being served as dinner to the very social connections their parents had hoped they would make. Elizabeth had created the perfect system, one that provided her with a steady supply of victims while simultaneously giving her access to the most influential people in European society. The girls who arrived at Elizabeth's castle found themselves in what appeared to be a luxurious educational environment. They were housed in comfortable quarters, provided with elegant clothing, and given instruction in music, languages, and social graces. For the first few weeks, everything seemed exactly as advertised. The young women wrote enthusiastic letters to their families, describing the wonderful opportunities they were receiving and the fascinating people they were meeting. But slowly, subtly, Elizabeth began selecting certain girls for advanced instruction that took place in the castle's lower levels. These special lessons, she explained, were designed to prepare them for the most exclusive levels of aristocratic society, where they would need to understand things that ordinary people could never comprehend. The selected girls felt honored to be chosen for this advanced training, never suspecting that they were being groomed for something far more sinister than social advancement. Elizabeth's advanced instruction began with what she called lessons in discretion. The selected girls were taught that true aristocracy required the ability to keep secrets, to participate in activities that common people would never understand, and to demonstrate absolute loyalty to their benefactors. These weren't just abstract concepts. Elizabeth tested each girl's commitment through increasingly disturbing tasks designed to break down their moral resistance and condition them for what was to come. The first test involved witnessing punishments of other servants who had supposedly committed minor infractions. Elizabeth would bring her students to observe as castle guards carried out elaborate tortures, explaining that this was how justice worked in the highest levels of society. She taught them that mercy was a weakness that only peasants could afford, while true nobility required the strength to make hard decisions without emotional interference. Those who showed appropriate enthusiasm for these demonstrations were invited to participate more directly. Elizabeth framed this participation as a privilege, telling the girls that they were being prepared for marriages to powerful men who would expect their wives to understand the realities of maintaining authority over lesser people. She convinced them that their squeamishness about violence was simply a sign of their common upbringing, something that needed to be overcome before they could truly belong in aristocratic circles. The psychological manipulation was masterful in its gradual escalation. Elizabeth never asked the girls to do anything that seemed dramatically different from what they had already accepted. Each step felt like a natural progression from the previous one, making it almost impossible for the victims to recognize the moment when they crossed from education into complicity. By the time they realized what was happening, they were already so deeply involved that escape seemed impossible. Elizabeth's methods for preparing human flesh evolved from crude experimentation into sophisticated culinary artistry. She employed master chefs who believed they were working with exotic game meats from distant lands, teaching them preparation techniques that would disguise the true nature of their ingredients. The flesh was aged in special cellars, marinated in wine and herbs, and prepared using methods borrowed from the finest kitchens in Europe. Her dinner parties became legendary throughout Hungarian society, attracting guests who traveled for days just to experience Elizabeth's renowned hospitality. The invitations were works of art themselves, written on the finest paper and sealed with the Báthory family crest. Recipients understood that attending one of Elizabeth's gatherings was both a social privilege and a political necessity for anyone seeking to maintain influence in Hungarian court circles. The castle's great hall was transformed for these occasions into a theater of carefully orchestrated horror, disguised as elegant entertainment. Elizabeth spared no expense on decorations, music, and presentation, understanding that the right atmosphere could make even the most discerning guests accept whatever she chose to serve them. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes covered the walls, their violent imagery providing subtle psychological preparation for what the guests would unknowingly consume. The menu for these dinners was carefully designed to introduce human flesh gradually, mixed with familiar meats and disguised with exotic spices that guests would assume came from foreign trade routes. Elizabeth would begin each meal with conventional dishes: roasted fowl, traditional game meats, familiar vegetables prepared in expected ways. This established a baseline of normalcy that made the later courses seem like natural extensions of the dining experience. As the evening progressed and wine loosened inhibitions, Elizabeth would introduce increasingly unusual dishes, each presented with elaborate stories about their origins and preparation methods. She spoke of rare herbs from distant monasteries, of aging techniques learned from ancient texts, of secret recipes passed down through generations of noble families. Her guests, flattered to be included in such exclusive culinary experiences, eagerly consumed whatever she offered. The human flesh was typically served during the middle courses, when guests were sufficiently intoxicated and socially committed to avoid appearing ungrateful for their hostess's hospitality. Elizabeth had learned to prepare it in ways that emphasized its similarity to veal or young lamb, cuts that would seem familiar while possessing subtle differences that she attributed to unique breeding or feeding methods. She took particular pleasure in watching her guests' faces as they consumed these special dishes, studying their expressions for signs of recognition or suspicion. Most showed nothing but appreciation for what they perceived as exceptionally fine cuisine, praising Elizabeth's chef and asking for details about where such excellent meat could be procured. Their enthusiastic responses convinced Elizabeth that she had successfully transformed cannibalism into an accepted form of aristocratic entertainment. But Elizabeth's ambitions extended beyond simply serving human flesh to unsuspecting guests. She began developing what she called her signature dishes, the elaborate preparations that showcased her creativity and demonstrated her complete mastery over life and death. These weren't just meals, they were artistic statements that expressed her philosophy about power, consumption, and the fundamental hierarchy that placed noble blood above common flesh. One of her most notorious creations involved what she termed youth preservation delicacies. Elizabeth had become convinced that consuming the flesh of young, beautiful women would help maintain her own beauty and vitality. She developed specific preparation methods for different body parts, believing that eating a victim's heart would strengthen her own, while consuming their skin would improve her complexion. These beliefs weren't entirely her own invention. They drew upon folk traditions and alchemical theories that were widespread throughout medieval Europe. The difference was that most people treated such ideas as metaphorical or symbolic, while Elizabeth took them as literal instructions for maintaining her power and beauty through cannibalism. She approached these practices with the same systematic methodology she brought to everything else, keeping detailed records of which preparations produced the best results. The servants who assisted in these preparations were bound to Elizabeth through a combination of terror, complicity, and financial dependence. She carefully selected individuals who had no family connections outside the castle, people whose disappearance would go unnoticed if they ever became inconvenient. Many were themselves former victims who had survived their initial torture and been offered the choice between death and service in Elizabeth's increasingly elaborate operations. These servants understood that their survival depended entirely on their usefulness to Elizabeth and their absolute discretion about her activities. They became extensions of her will, carrying out the most horrific tasks with mechanical efficiency, while maintaining the appearance of normal household staff when guests were present. The psychological toll of this existence was enormous, but Elizabeth had created a system where rebellion or escape seemed impossible. The castle's kitchens were transformed into a complex operation that resembled a combination of restaurant, laboratory, and slaughterhouse. Different areas were designated for different stages of the process: preparation spaces where victims were processed, aging rooms where meat was treated and stored, and cooking areas where the final dishes were created. The entire operation was hidden beneath the normal activities of a great noble household, invisible to casual observers but terrifyingly efficient in its actual purpose. Elizabeth's reputation as a hostess continued to grow throughout the 1580s and 1590s, attracting increasingly important guests to her dinner parties. Foreign ambassadors, church officials, military commanders, and members of royal families throughout Europe came to experience her legendary hospitality. None of them suspected that their appreciation for her cuisine was based on their unknowing participation in systematic cannibalism. The psychological impact on Elizabeth herself was profound, but difficult to detect from the outside. She had created a world where her most extreme fantasies were not only possible, but celebrated by the very people who should have been horrified by them. This validation of her cannibalistic practices seemed to convince Elizabeth that she had transcended normal human limitations and achieved a form of existence that placed her above conventional morality. Her journals from this period reveal a woman who had completely lost touch with any normal understanding of right and wrong. She wrote about her dinner parties with the same enthusiasm that other nobles brought to describing hunting expeditions or musical performances. The suffering of her victims was completely absent from these accounts. They existed only as ingredients in her elaborate culinary creations, their humanity erased through the process of consumption. But perhaps most chilling was Elizabeth's growing belief that she was providing a valuable service to European society by eliminating what she considered inferior human specimens while simultaneously nourishing the superior bloodlines of her dinner guests. She had convinced herself that her cannibalistic practices were not just acceptable, but actually beneficial to the natural order of things. This twisted philosophy would soon face its ultimate test as Elizabeth's activities attracted the attention of investigators who were not as easily manipulated as her dinner guests. The careful balance between horror and hospitality that had sustained her operations for decades was about to collapse, bringing her face to face with consequences that even her noble birth and political connections might not be able to prevent. The investigation that would ultimately bring down Elizabeth Báthory began not with moral outrage over her cannibalistic dinner parties, but with something far more mundane: unpaid debts and missing dowries. In the winter of 1609, several minor noble families approached King Matthias II with complaints that their daughters had vanished while supposedly receiving education at Elizabeth's castle. More troubling still, the substantial payments they had made for this education had disappeared along with the girls themselves. What started as a financial inquiry soon uncovered evidence of something far more disturbing. The king's investigators, led by György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, discovered that dozens of young women from across Eastern Europe had traveled to Elizabeth's various castles over the past 2 decades, but very few had ever returned home. The official explanations, deaths from illness, marriages to distant nobles, decisions to enter religious life, began to seem suspiciously convenient when examined collectively. Thurzo was no naive court official, easily fooled by aristocratic charm. He had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of Hungarian politics and had developed a keen instinct for detecting deception. More importantly, he possessed something that had protected Elizabeth for so long: noble birth and political connections powerful enough to challenge even the mighty Báthory family. When he began his investigation, Elizabeth finally faced an opponent who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or eliminated. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a former kitchen servant named Dorothea Zentes, who had fled Elizabeth's service years earlier and had been living in hiding ever since. Thurzo's investigators tracked her down in a remote village where she had been working as a washerwoman, still terrified that Elizabeth might discover her location and drag her back to the castle. When approached by royal investigators, her initial response was complete denial of any knowledge about unusual activities at the castle. But, as the interrogation continued, her resolve began to crumble. Dorothea had witnessed horrors that had haunted her dreams for years, and the psychological burden of keeping these secrets had nearly driven her mad. When the investigators promised protection from Elizabeth's revenge, she finally broke down and revealed details that shocked even these experienced law enforcement officials. Dorothea described dinner parties where she had been ordered to prepare what she initially believed were unusual cuts of veal or lamb, only to discover that the meat came from the castle's dungeons rather than its pastures. She spoke of storage rooms filled with carefully butchered human remains, of elaborate preparation rituals that transformed murder victims into elegant cuisine, and of Elizabeth's meticulous record-keeping that documented every aspect of these cannibalistic feasts. But perhaps most damning was Dorothea's testimony about the guests who attended these dinner parties. She provided names, dates, and detailed descriptions of nobles throughout Europe who had unknowingly participated in Elizabeth's cannibalistic entertainment. The political implications were staggering. If this testimony proved accurate, dozens of the most powerful people in European society had been consuming human flesh at Elizabeth's table. Armed with this testimony, Thurzo's investigators began examining the financial records of Elizabeth's various estates. What they discovered painted a picture of an operation far more extensive and systematic than anyone had imagined. The accounts showed payments to specialized craftsmen for unusual equipment, metal tables with drainage systems, specialized knives and cutting tools, and preservation materials that had no obvious connection to normal household activities. More revealing were the purchasing records for Elizabeth's famous dinner parties. The amounts of conventional meat ordered from suppliers were far too small to feed the number of guests who attended these gatherings. Either Elizabeth was serving impossibly tiny portions to some of Europe's most important nobles, or she was supplementing her official food purchases with ingredients obtained through other means. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Thurzo decided to conduct a surprise inspection of Elizabeth's primary residence at Čachtice Castle. On the night of December 29, 1610, royal investigators surrounded the castle and demanded immediate entry. Elizabeth, caught completely off guard by this unprecedented intrusion into her private domain, had no time to conceal the evidence of her activities or prepare her usual facade of aristocratic respectability. What the investigators found in the castle's lower levels defied comprehension. Room after room contained evidence of systematic torture and murder on an industrial scale. But more horrifying than the torture chambers themselves were the adjoining areas that had been converted into what could only be described as a human butcher shop. Metal tables bore the stains of countless victims, while specialized tools for dismemberment hung from the walls like implements in a surgeon's laboratory. The preservation rooms contained cuts of human flesh at various stages of preparation, carefully labeled with notes about aging times and intended uses. Some had been marinated in wine and herbs, others had been salted and dried, and still others had been prepared using techniques borrowed from the finest European kitchens. The organization and attention to detail suggested this wasn't the work of a deranged individual acting on impulse, but rather a carefully planned operation that had been refined over many years. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery of Elizabeth's detailed journals, which documented not just her methods for killing and preparing victims, but also the reactions of guests who had consumed these special delicacies at her dinner parties. She had recorded which preparations were most successful, which guests seemed to enjoy the unusual flavors most, and which presentation methods were most effective at disguising the true nature of what was being served. The journals also contained guest lists for dozens of dinner parties spanning more than 2 decades, creating a comprehensive record of European nobles who had unknowingly participated in cannibalistic feasts. The names read like a directory of the continent's most powerful families: princes, cardinals, military commanders, and wealthy merchants who had built their reputations on their refined tastes and cultural sophistication. When confronted with this evidence, Elizabeth's initial response was not denial but indignation that anyone would dare question her activities. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the investigators' horror, explaining that she had simply been exploring the full potential of aristocratic privilege. In her mind, the ability to transform murder victims into elegant cuisine represented the ultimate expression of noble power over common people. Her confession, recorded by court scribes who could barely believe what they were hearing, revealed the depth of her psychological disconnection from normal human morality. Elizabeth described her cannibalistic dinner parties with the same pride that other nobles might discuss their art collections or musical accomplishments. She spoke of the technical challenges involved in preparing human flesh, the satisfaction of successfully deceiving sophisticated guests, and the pleasure of exercising absolute power over life and death. But as the full scope of the investigation became clear, Elizabeth finally began to understand that her noble birth might not protect her from the consequences of her actions. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the political implications of a public trial would threaten some of the most powerful families in Europe. Something had to be done to contain the scandal while still delivering some form of justice for her crimes. The solution came in the form of a secret tribunal that would try Elizabeth without the public scrutiny that a normal trial would attract. The proceedings were conducted in complete secrecy, with only a handful of trusted officials present to hear the evidence and render judgment. This arrangement protected the unwitting guests who had attended Elizabeth's dinner parties, while still allowing for some form of legal accountability. The testimony presented at this secret trial painted a picture of systematic cruelty that extended far beyond even the cannibalistic dinner parties. Witnesses described torture sessions that lasted for days, elaborate methods of execution designed to maximize suffering, and a complete disregard for human life that shocked even experienced legal officials. The death toll was estimated at over 600 victims, making Elizabeth one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. But the most disturbing aspect of the testimony wasn't the scale of the killing, but the calculated way Elizabeth had transformed murder into entertainment and cannibalism into cuisine. She had created a system that allowed her to indulge her most extreme sadistic impulses, while simultaneously maintaining her position as one of Europe's most celebrated hostesses. The dinner parties weren't just a way to dispose of evidence. They were the ultimate expression of her power and contempt for human life. The verdict was never in doubt, but the sentence posed unique challenges. Executing Elizabeth would create a public scandal that could destabilize Hungarian politics and embarrass some of Europe's most powerful families. At the same time, allowing her to continue living freely was clearly impossible given the overwhelming evidence of her crimes. The compromise solution was imprisonment for life within her own castle, walled up in a set of rooms with only small slots for food and waste removal. This arrangement satisfied the demands of justice while keeping the details of her crimes from becoming public knowledge. Elizabeth would spend her remaining years in solitude, cut off from the victims she had terrorized and the guests she had unknowingly transformed into cannibals. Her accomplices faced harsher fates. The servants who had assisted in the torture and preparation of victims were tried publicly and executed in ways designed to demonstrate royal justice while avoiding specific details about their crimes. They were portrayed as corrupt individuals who had taken advantage of their noble employer's trust rather than as participants in systematic cannibalism. The cover-up extended to the dinner party guests themselves, who were never officially informed about the true nature of the meals they had consumed. Many probably suspected something unusual about Elizabeth's cuisine, but the social and political consequences of acknowledging their participation in cannibalism were too severe to contemplate. The conspiracy of silence that protected these unwitting cannibals would last for centuries. Elizabeth's final years in captivity provided no evidence of remorse or recognition of the horror she had inflicted on hundreds of victims. Guards reported that she spent her time writing detailed plans for new torture methods and elaborate dinner party menus that she would never have the opportunity to implement. Even in imprisonment, her mind remained focused on the systematic transformation of human suffering into aristocratic entertainment. The legend that grew up around Elizabeth Báthory focused primarily on her supposed bathing in virgin blood to maintain her beauty, a story that was both more palatable and less politically dangerous than the reality of her cannibalistic dinner parties. This sanitized version of her crimes allowed future generations to treat her as a Gothic curiosity, rather than confronting the uncomfortable truth about aristocratic complicity in systematic murder and cannibalism. But the real horror of Elizabeth Báthory's story isn't just the individual cruelty she inflicted on her victims. It's the way she was able to transform that cruelty into socially acceptable entertainment for the most powerful people in European society. Her dinner parties revealed the moral bankruptcy that lay beneath the elegant surface of aristocratic culture, showing how easily sophisticated people could be manipulated into participating in the most extreme forms of human degradation. The guests who praised Elizabeth's exotic cuisine and sophisticated hospitality were the same people who made decisions about war and peace, who controlled the lives of millions of common people, and who shaped the moral and cultural standards of their societies. Their unknowing participation in cannibalism raises disturbing questions about the relationship between power, privilege, and moral responsibility that extend far beyond the confines of a single medieval castle. Today, the ruins of Čachtice Castle still stand in modern-day Slovakia, but the rooms where Elizabeth's dinner parties took place have long since crumbled into dust. The elegant halls that once echoed with the laughter of European nobility and the screams of torture victims are now home only to bats and memories. Yet the questions raised by Elizabeth's crimes remain as relevant now as they were 4 centuries ago. How many of us would recognize evil if it were presented to us with sufficient sophistication and social approval? How easily can moral standards be corrupted when the corruption is gradual and comes with social benefits? And what does it say about human nature that some of history's most refined and cultured people could unknowingly participate in systematic cannibalism without ever questioning what they were consuming? Elizabeth Báthory's legacy isn't just the hundreds of people she murdered or the elaborate tortures she devised. Her true legacy lies in demonstrating how easily evil can disguise itself as sophistication, how power can corrupt not just those who wield it, but those who benefit from it, and how the most horrific crimes can be hidden in plain sight when they serve the interest of those with enough influence to look the other way. The woman who fed human flesh to European nobility as royal cuisine had created more than just an elaborate system of murder and cannibalism. She had created a mirror that reflected the moral emptiness at the heart of aristocratic privilege, showing how easily civilized people could be transformed into unwitting participants in the most uncivilized acts imaginable. The dinner guests who unknowingly consumed human flesh at Elizabeth's table weren't just random victims of deception. They represented the absolute pinnacle of European civilization. Cardinals who preached about the sanctity of human life savored cuts of human meat while discussing theology. Military commanders who claimed to fight for Christian values praised the exotic flavors of carefully prepared human organs. Wealthy merchants who built their fortunes on moral principles returned home raving about Elizabeth's unparalleled culinary sophistication. This wasn't ignorance or accident. It was willful blindness enabled by social privilege. These guests had the education, experience, and moral frameworks necessary to recognize that something was fundamentally wrong with what they were consuming. The texture was different, the taste was unusual, and the circumstances surrounding these exclusive meals should have raised questions in any reasonable person's mind. But asking questions would have meant acknowledging uncomfortable possibilities, and uncomfortable possibilities threatened their social standing, their political relationships, and their carefully constructed self-images as refined, moral individuals. It was easier to accept Elizabeth's exotic explanations and praise her sophisticated palate than to confront the reality that their hostess might be serving them something unspeakable. The psychological mechanisms that allowed these dinner party guests to participate unknowingly in cannibalism are the same ones that enable systematic evil throughout history. People convince themselves that their suspicions are unfounded, that their discomfort is simply squeamishness, that surely someone as respectable as their host wouldn't be capable of true horror. They choose comfort over truth, social acceptance over moral clarity, personal advancement over ethical responsibility. Elizabeth understood these psychological weaknesses better than most modern psychologists. She had spent decades studying the way powerful people rationalized uncomfortable situations, and she used this knowledge to create a perfect trap. Her dinner parties weren't just about serving human flesh. They were about demonstrating the moral cowardice of Europe's supposed moral leaders. The most chilling aspect of Elizabeth's crimes wasn't the torture, the murder, or even the cannibalism itself. It was the way she exposed the hollow core of aristocratic civilization, showing that all the art, culture, philosophy, and religious devotion that defined European high society meant nothing when confronted with systematic evil presented in a socially acceptable package. Her legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own moral courage and psychological honesty. How many of us would have been different from those dinner party guests? How many of us would have asked the hard questions, challenged the comfortable explanations, risked social embarrassment or political consequences to confront obvious evil? The honest answer is probably very few. Elizabeth Báthory died in her walled prison in 1614, but the moral questions raised by her crimes echo through the centuries. Every time we choose comfort over truth, social acceptance over moral courage, personal advancement over ethical responsibility, we participate in the same psychological mechanisms that allowed European nobility to unknowingly consume human flesh while praising their hostess's sophistication. The Blood Countess created more than a reign of terror. She created a mirror that still reflects our deepest moral failures. Her dinner parties remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it comes dressed in silk and jewels, served on golden plates, accompanied by beautiful music and intelligent conversation. Sometimes the most civilized settings hide the most uncivilized acts, and the most cultured people become unwitting participants in unspeakable horror. The most terrifying truth about Elizabeth Báthory's story isn't that she existed, it's that she thrived. For over 2 decades, she operated her cannibalistic dinner parties without detection, building a reputation as one of Europe's most celebrated hostesses, while systematically feeding human flesh to the continent's most powerful people. This wasn't the work of a deranged individual operating in isolation. This was a carefully constructed system that exploited the moral blindness of an entire social class. When we examine the guest list from Elizabeth's dinner parties, we're not looking at a collection of naive victims who stumbled into an unfortunate situation. We're looking at the architects of European civilization, the people who shaped laws, commanded armies, influenced religious doctrine, and controlled vast wealth. These were individuals with access to the finest education, the most sophisticated cultural experiences, and the deepest understanding of human nature that their age could provide. Yet when presented with evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with their dining experience, they chose willful ignorance over uncomfortable truth. They praised exotic flavors instead of questioning unusual textures. They accepted elaborate explanations instead of demanding simple answers. They prioritized social relationships over moral responsibility, personal comfort over ethical courage. This pattern of behavior reveals something profound about the relationship between power and moral cowardice. The higher these individuals rose in social hierarchy, the more invested they became in maintaining the systems that sustained their privilege. Questioning Elizabeth's dinner parties would have meant acknowledging that their refined tastes and sophisticated palates had led them to participate in cannibalism. Such an acknowledgement would have shattered their self-image as moral, cultured, civilized people. So they didn't question, they didn't investigate, they didn't demand transparency. Instead, they returned home and recommended Elizabeth's hospitality to their friends, spreading her reputation throughout European high society and ensuring a steady stream of new victims for her elaborate system of murder and consumption. The children who died in Elizabeth's dungeons weren't just casualties of one woman's sadistic impulses. They were sacrifices to a social system that valued aristocratic comfort over human life, that prioritized political relationships over moral clarity, that chose elegant lies over ugly truths. Every guest who praised Elizabeth's cuisine while ignoring obvious warning signs became complicit in the deaths that followed their visits. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire story is how easily it could happen again. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Elizabeth's crimes, the willingness to ignore uncomfortable evidence, the prioritization of social acceptance over moral courage, the assumption that respectable people couldn't be capable of true evil. These mechanisms exist in every society, in every era, in every human heart. We tell ourselves that we're different, that we're more enlightened, that we would never participate unknowingly in systematic horror. But the truth is that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs. It comes disguised as respectability, wrapped in sophistication, endorsed by authority figures we trust and admire. It asks us to ignore small inconsistencies, to accept convenient explanations, to prioritize our comfort over difficult questions. Elizabeth Báthory's dinner parties ended over 400 years ago, but the moral challenges they represent continue today. Every time we choose not to investigate obvious injustices because doing so would be inconvenient, every time we accept comfortable lies rather than confronting uncomfortable truths, every time we prioritize our social standing over our ethical responsibilities, we participate in the same moral failures that allowed European nobility to become unwitting cannibals. The woman who fed human flesh to unsuspecting guests didn't just commit murder. She exposed the fundamental hollowness at the heart of civilized society. Her legacy isn't just a catalog of crimes, but a mirror that reflects our own capacity for moral blindness, our own willingness to participate in evil when it's presented with sufficient sophistication and social approval. The golden plates from Elizabeth's dinner parties have long since tarnished, but the questions they raise about human nature, moral courage, and the price of willful ignorance remain as relevant today as they were in the shadowed halls of Čachtice Castle. The Blood Countess is dead, but the moral cowardice that enabled her crimes lives on in every person who chooses comfort over truth. In every society that values respectability over responsibility. In every civilization that mistakes sophistication for morality. In the end, Elizabeth Báthory's most horrific achievement wasn't the hundreds of people she tortured and killed. It was demonstrating how easily the most civilized people could be transformed into participants in the most uncivilized acts. How readily moral principles could be abandoned when maintaining them became inconvenient. And how completely evil could disguise itself as elegance when the audience was willing to be deceived. The dinner party is over, but the meal was never really about the food. It was about us.